Ezra Collins had sworn off saving people 7 years ago, the day he buried his wife and daughter beneath the twisted remains of their homestead. The avalanche had taken them while he was away cutting timber, and the guilt had carved him hollow as a dead tree. So when he heard the crying on the wind that bitter February morning, his first instinct was to turn away and pretend the sound was just another mountain ghost haunting his solitude. But the crying didn't stop. Standing in the doorway of his remote cabin, Ezra squinted through the swirling snow that had been falling for 3 days straight. The Colorado Territory wilderness stretched endlessly before him, white and merciless, the kind of landscape that swallowed the unprepared without a trace. In 7 years of self-imposed exile, he'd grown comfortable with the silence, with the predictable rhythm of survival that asked nothing of his heart and everything of his hands. The sound came again, not one voice but several, children's voices thin with cold and terror. "Damn it," Ezra muttered, grabbing his heavy coat and the oil lantern that had guided him through countless dark nights alone. His boots crunched through knee-deep snow as he followed the desperate sounds, his weathered face grim with the knowledge that whatever he found would complicate the carefully ordered emptiness of his life. He found them huddled beneath a cluster of pine trees, 5 figures nearly buried in white. A woman and 4 children, with what looked like a baby pressed against the woman's chest. Their wagon lay overturned 50 yards away, its contents scattered and half-frozen, telling the story of travelers caught in nature's cruelest trap. The woman looked up as his lantern light fell across her face, and Ezra felt something crack inside his chest. She was young, maybe 30, with auburn hair escaping from beneath a woolen hood, and eyes that held both desperation and a fierce protective strength he recognized. The kind of strength that came from being responsible for lives more precious than your own. "Please," she whispered, her lips blue with cold. "The children. They can't take much more of this." Ezra had built his isolation on the simple principle that caring about people led to losing them, that the safest heart was a closed one. For 7 years, he lived by one unbreakable rule. Don't get involved, don't get attached, don't give fate another chance to tear away what you love. But as he looked at the baby's tiny face, barely visible beneath layers of inadequate blankets, something inside him shifted like ice cracking on a spring river. These weren't just people. They were a family on the edge of becoming a tragedy, and he was the only thing standing between them and the kind of loss that had shaped his last 7 years. What Ezra Collins didn't know, as he made the decision that would shatter his carefully constructed solitude, was that sometimes the people you save end up saving you right back. Sometimes the family you rescue becomes the family that finally teaches your frozen heart how to beat again. And sometimes a man who spent 7 years running from love finds that it's been waiting for him all along, wrapped in blankets and carried on the mountain wind, arriving exactly when he's ready to stop being afraid of losing everything and start being brave enough to fight for it instead. Ezra didn't speak as he lifted the baby from the woman's trembling arms, surprised by how natural the weight felt against his chest, despite 7 years without holding a child. The tiny girl, he could tell by the pink ribbon barely visible beneath her inadequate wrappings, was frighteningly cold, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Can you walk?" he asked the woman, his voice rougher than he'd intended from years of disuse in conversation. "I think so." She struggled to her feet, swaying slightly. "The children? I'll come back for them." Ezra's eyes swept over the 4 other young ones huddled together like wolf pups. The oldest, a girl with dark hair and fierce eyes, was trying to shield the younger ones with her own body. "Stay put. All of you." He turned toward his cabin without another word, the baby pressed against his coat. Behind him, he heard the woman's voice, gentle but firm. "Children, we're going to be all right. The kind man is going to help us. Kind man." The words followed him through the snow like an accusation. Ezra Collins hadn't been kind in 7 years. Kindness was a luxury he couldn't afford, a weakness that led to attachment, and attachment led to loss so profound it could hollow out a man's soul. But as he pushed through his cabin door and felt the blessed warmth envelop them, Ezra realized he'd already crossed a line he'd sworn never to cross again. The baby stirred against his chest, making a small sound that went straight through him like a knife between the ribs. His cabin was sparse but warm, one main room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft above, and a small alcove that served as a kitchen. Everything was practical, efficient, built for one person who needed nothing from the outside world. Now suddenly it felt impossibly small for what was about to happen. Ezra laid the baby on his own bed, quickly building up the fire to chase away the deadly chill. Then he grabbed every blanket he owned and headed back into the storm. The woman, Margaret, she'd whispered her name during the trek back, was barely conscious by the time he returned. The children clung to each other in exhausted terror, their eyes wide with the kind of shock that came from watching death circle closer with each passing hour. "Lucy," the oldest girl said, her voice steady despite her chattering teeth. "My name's Lucy. These are my brothers and sisters, Samuel, Emma, Ethan." She gestured to each child in turn, and Ezra was struck by the maturity in her young face, the weight of responsibility no child should have to carry. "How old are you, Lucy?" Ezra asked as he gathered the youngest boy into his arms. 12. Her chin lifted with pride and defiance. "I've been taking care of them since—" She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Ezra recognized the look of someone who'd learned too young that the world could take away everything you loved without warning or mercy. It took 3 trips to get them all to the cabin. Margaret had to lean heavily on his arm, her body shaking with cold and exhaustion. The children followed silently, too spent for the curiosity or chatter that might have been natural in better circumstances. Once inside, Ezra's cabin transformed into something he barely recognized. Children's voices filled spaces that had known only his own breathing for 7 years. The baby's soft cries mixed with the crackle of the fire and the rustle of blankets being arranged. Margaret's gentle murmurs as she checked each child for frostbite brought a tenderness to the rough-hewn walls that made Ezra's chest tight with something he couldn't name. "Samuel, don't touch that," Lucy warned sharply as the 10-year-old boy reached toward Ezra's rifle mounted above the fireplace. "It's all right," Ezra said quietly, causing both children to look at him with surprise. "But your sister's right. That's not a toy." Samuel's eyes were wide with fascination. "Are you a real mountain man? Do you fight bears and wolves and Indians?" "Samuel," Margaret's voice carried a note of embarrassment despite her exhaustion. "I'm sorry, Mr. Collins, Ezra Collins." He studied her face in the firelight, noting the intelligence in her green eyes, the way she held herself despite her circumstances. "And it's just Ezra. I don't fight much of anything anymore. Mostly try to avoid trouble." "Then why do you live all alone up here?" This from Emma, one of the twins, her small face serious with curiosity. The question hit harder than it should have. Ezra busied himself with adding wood to the fire, aware that all eyes were on him, waiting for an answer he wasn't sure he could give. "Sometimes a man needs space to think," he said finally. "Our pa said the same thing," little Ethan piped up, "before he went away and didn't come back." The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding of loss. Margaret reached out to touch her son's hair, her eyes meeting Ezra's across the fire. In that moment, he saw his own pain reflected in her face, the weight of being left behind, of having to be strong when strength felt impossible. "Well," Margaret said softly, her voice carefully cheerful for the children's sake, "we won't be staying long enough to be a bother. Just until the storm passes and we can make arrangements to get to town." But even as she spoke the words, Ezra could see the doubt in her eyes. The nearest town was 30 miles through treacherous mountain passes, and winter wasn't done with them yet. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, and even if it did, traveling with 4 children and a baby in these conditions would be nothing short of suicidal. "Where were you headed?" Ezra asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Denver," Margaret said, then hesitated. That is, we had plans to meet someone there. But our guide abandoned us 2 days ago when the weather turned bad. Took most of our supplies with him." Her voice carried the bitter edge of betrayal and desperation, carefully controlled for the children's sake. Ezra nodded, understanding more than she'd said. Another family abandoned by men who promised protection, but delivered only betrayal when times got tough. It was a story as old as the territory itself. People heading west with dreams and finding only hardship and broken promises. You'll stay here until it's safe to travel, he said simply, as if the decision hadn't just turned his carefully ordered world upside down. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. We can't impose on you like that. We have no way to pay. I didn't ask for payment. The children were watching this exchange with the intensity of young ones who understood that adult decisions would determine their fate. Baby Grace chose that moment to wake up, her cries filling the cabin with immediate, urgent need. Without thinking, Ezra moved toward the sound, then caught himself. This wasn't his child, wasn't his responsibility. He'd already done more than he should have, more than was safe for the careful balance he'd built around his solitude. But Margaret was struggling to sit up, exhaustion and cold making her movements clumsy, and the baby's cries were growing more desperate. Before he could stop himself, Ezra was there, lifting the infant with careful hands, rocking her gently until her cries subsided into hiccups and then silence. When he looked up, he found 5 pairs of eyes watching him, with expressions ranging from surprise to something that looked dangerously like hope. "You're good with babies," Lucy observed, a note of wonder in her practical voice. Ezra's throat tightened. "I had some practice once." He didn't elaborate, couldn't explain about the daughter who would have been Grace's age if avalanches didn't bury dreams along with bodies. But something in his voice must have conveyed the loss, because Margaret's expression softened with understanding. "Thank you," she whispered. And in those 2 words, Ezra heard everything. Gratitude for the rescue, apology for the intrusion, and a recognition of kindness that he wasn't sure he deserved. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, and snow continued to pile against the cabin windows. They were trapped together, this makeshift family, and the man who'd sworn off the dangerous business of caring about people. But as Ezra looked around his transformed cabin, at children settling into sleep by his fire, at a woman whose strength reminded him of everything he'd tried to forget, he realized that sometimes the very thing you've been running from is exactly what you need to find your way home. What he didn't know yet was that the storm raging outside was nothing compared to the one brewing in his carefully guarded heart, and that by morning, the walls he'd built around his emotions would be tested by something far more dangerous than wind and snow, the terrifying, wonderful possibility of belonging somewhere again. The storm raged for 6 days, and by the 3rd morning, Ezra's cabin had settled into rhythms he'd forgotten could exist. He woke not to silence, but to the soft murmur of Margaret singing lullabies to baby Grace, the whispered conversations between the twins, and Lucy's gentle corrections as she helped Samuel with the reading lessons Margaret insisted on maintaining despite their circumstances. Ezra lay in his makeshift bed by the fire. He'd given the sleeping loft to the family and listened to the sounds of people living together. It should have felt intrusive after 7 years of solitude, but instead it felt like something inside him was slowly thawing, like ice breaking up on a spring river. "Mr. Ezra," Emma's small voice broke through his thoughts. "Are you awake?" He opened his eyes to find the 7-year-old standing nearby, fully dressed despite the early hour, her blonde hair braided neatly by her older sister. In her hands, she held his coffee pot with the serious concentration of someone entrusted with an important task. "Mama said I could help make coffee if you don't mind," she continued, her voice carefully polite. "I'm very good at not spilling." Ezra sat up, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sure you are, but that pot's mighty heavy for someone your size." "I'm stronger than I look," Emma declared with the fierce pride of a child determined to prove her worth. "Lucy says we all have to help so we're not a burden." The word burden in that small voice made something twist in Ezra's chest. He could see Margaret across the room, pretending to tend to the baby while clearly listening to the exchange, her jaw tight with the kind of tension that came from being entirely dependent on someone else's kindness. "Tell you what," Ezra said, standing and stretching muscles stiff from sleeping on the floor. "How about you help me, and I'll teach you the right way to make mountain coffee. That way, if you ever find yourself needing to make coffee for a camp full of hungry men, you'll know how." Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? You'll teach me? Really?" But first rule of mountain coffee, you never make it alone. It's always better when you've got a partner. As they worked together, Ezra found himself explaining not just the coffee-making process, but the reasons behind each step. Why you had to let the ground settle, how to judge the right color by the firelight, why mountain water made everything taste better. "You're a good teacher," Margaret said quietly, appearing beside them with Grace on her hip. "Emma's been wanting to learn grown-up things since—" She paused, then continued more carefully. "Since we started this journey." Ezra glanced at her, noting the shadows under her green eyes, the way she held herself with careful control. "How long have you been traveling?" 3 months. Margaret's voice carried the weight of those weeks. "We left St. Louis in November. I thought we'd reach Denver before the worst of winter set in, but everything that could go wrong did go wrong." "What's in Denver?" Ezra asked, though he sensed the answer might be painful. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, adjusting Grace's blanket with hands that trembled slightly. "Hope, I suppose. My late husband's brother wrote that there might be work for a teacher, a place for us to start over. After James died, staying in St. Louis became difficult." She didn't elaborate, but Ezra could fill in the gaps. A widow with 5 children would have few options in civilized society, especially if there were debts or other complications. The frontier might be harsh, but it was often the only place where people could truly start fresh. "Coffee's ready," Emma announced proudly, her small chest puffed with accomplishment. Soon the whole family was gathered around the fire, sharing the simple breakfast Ezra had prepared: cornbread, bacon, and the coffee that Emma insisted on serving to everyone personally. Samuel peppered Ezra with questions about mountain life, while Ethan mostly listened with wide eyes. Lucy remained more reserved, but he caught her watching him with the calculating gaze of someone trying to determine if he could be trusted with her siblings' welfare. "Mr. Ezra," Samuel said around a mouthful of cornbread, "do you really know how to track animals? Lucy said you probably just buy your meat in town, but I said you look like someone who could track a bear." "Samuel," Margaret's voice carried gentle reproach, but Ezra saw the hint of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "It's all right," Ezra said. "And yes, I can track, but tracking's not about following bears. It's about understanding how animals think, where they go for food and water and shelter. Want me to show you?" The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and before long, Ezra found himself at the cabin's single window, pointing out signs in the snow that the children had never noticed. The way the trees bent indicated prevailing winds. The shallow depressions showed where deer had bedded down for warmth. Even the pattern of snow accumulation told stories about what moved through these woods. "It's like reading a book," Lucy said, her reserve finally cracking with genuine interest. "All those marks mean something." "Exactly. And just like with books, the more you practice reading the signs, the better you get at understanding the story." Margaret watched this exchange with something soft and wondering in her expression. "You really are a teacher," she said quietly. "Have you ever thought about—" "No." Ezra's voice came out sharper than he intended, cutting off whatever she'd been about to suggest. The moment of easy companionship shattered, replaced by the familiar walls he'd built around anything that resembled a future with other people. The children sensed the sudden tension, their chatter dying away. Margaret's face flushed with embarrassment at having overstepped some invisible boundary. "I'm sorry," she said stiffly. "I didn't mean to presume." "It's fine." But Ezra's voice remained distant as he turned away from the window. "I need to check the animals." He pulled on his heavy coat and stepped out into the storm, leaving behind the warmth and the complicated tangle of emotions that came with caring about people. The cold air hit his face like a slap, but it was cleaner than the suffocating feeling of walls closing in around possibilities he couldn't afford to consider. Outside, the wind was finally starting to die down, though snow still fell in thick, lazy flakes. Ezra made his way to the small shelter where he kept his 2 horses and handful of chickens, going through the familiar motions of feeding and watering with automatic efficiency. But his mind wasn't on the animals. It was on Emma's proud smile when she'd served the coffee, on Samuel's eager questions, on the way Lucy had started to look at him like he might be someone worth trusting. It was on Margaret's gentle voice as she sang to the baby, and the way she'd looked when she'd called him a teacher, like she could see something in him that he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. Teaching. He'd wanted to be a teacher once, before the war, before the homestead, before the avalanche took away his reasons for planning a future. He'd taught his own daughter to read, had been looking forward to showing her how to track animals, how to read the stories written in snow and wind, and the turning of seasons. The memory hit him like a physical blow, and Ezra braced himself against the shed wall, fighting against the grief that still had the power to drop him to his knees. This was why he lived alone, why he'd sworn off getting attached to people. Because caring about someone meant they could destroy you when they left, whether by choice or by the cruel randomness of fate. Mr. Ezra? He turned to find Lucy standing in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. Her face was serious with the kind of grown-up concern no 12-year-old should have to carry. "Mama's crying," she said simply. "She thinks you're mad at us." Ezra's chest tightened. "I'm not mad at anyone." "Then why did you leave like that?" "Samuel thinks he said something wrong, and Emma keeps asking if we have to go back outside in the snow." The practical directness of her questions cut straight through his defenses. Here was a child who'd learned to read adult moods for survival, who'd taken on the responsibility of protecting her younger siblings because the adults in her life had failed them. "Your family didn't do anything wrong," Ezra said quietly. "Sometimes grown-ups have to step outside when they're feeling too much all at once." Lucy studied his face with eyes too old for her age. "Mama says that's what Papa used to do before he went away for good. She says some people leave when things get hard instead of staying to work them out." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Ezra knelt down so he was at eye level with her, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide behind her protective bravery. "Lucy, I want you to listen to me carefully. I'm not your papa, and I don't know what happened with him. But I'm not going anywhere while this storm lasts, and I'm not going to put you or your family back out in the cold. That's a promise." Some of the tension left her small shoulders. "What about after the storm?" It was a fair question, and it deserved an honest answer. The problem was, Ezra didn't know what that answer was anymore. 3 days ago, he would have said he'd help them get to the nearest town and then send them on their way with supplies and best wishes. But 3 days ago, he hadn't watched Emma beam with pride over coffee, or seen Samuel's fascination with the world beyond civilization, or felt the weight of baby Grace sleeping trustfully in his arms. "After the storm, we'll figure out what's best for everyone," he said finally. "But that's a tomorrow problem. Today we just focus on staying warm and safe." Lucy nodded, accepting this answer with the pragmatism of someone who'd learned that adults couldn't always promise happy endings, but they could promise to do their best with today. They walked back to the cabin together, and when Ezra opened the door, he was greeted by the sight of Margaret wiping her eyes quickly while trying to comfort a clearly distressed Emma. The twins were huddled together on the makeshift bed, and even Samuel had lost his usual enthusiasm. "I'm sorry," Ezra said, addressing the room in general but looking directly at Margaret. "I didn't mean to worry anyone. Sometimes I need to check on things outside, but I should have explained that better." Margaret's eyes searched his face, looking for the reassurance she needed that he wasn't about to abandon them to the storm. "We understand," she said carefully. "We're grateful for everything you've done, and we don't want to be more trouble than we already are." "You're not trouble," Ezra said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. "You're just different from what I'm used to." "Different how?" This from Samuel, his curiosity overcoming his earlier worry. Ezra looked around the cabin at the evidence of lives being lived in the space he'd kept empty for so long. Children's clothes drying by the fire, Margaret's sewing basket in the corner, baby Grace's makeshift crib fashioned from a wooden crate, the sound of breathing that wasn't his own, the constant hum of conversation and questions and laughter that had replaced 7 years of silence. "Different like a house feels when it stops being just a place to sleep and starts being a home," he said quietly. And as he said it, Ezra realized that somewhere in the last 3 days, that's exactly what had happened. His carefully maintained shelter had become something else entirely, something that would feel empty and hollow when they left. The question was whether he was brave enough to do anything about it, or if he'd let fear drive him back into the safety of solitude when the storm finally passed, and the choice became his to make. By the 10th day, the storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world sculpted in pristine white that sparkled like crushed diamonds under the afternoon sun. The children pressed their faces to the cabin windows, marveling at the transformed landscape, while Ezra stood behind them, acutely aware that clear skies meant decisions that could no longer be postponed. "It's beautiful," Margaret said softly, joining him at the window with Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I've never seen snow like this, so deep and untouched." "Beautiful and dangerous," Ezra replied. "That much snow means the passes won't be clear for weeks, maybe not until spring thaw." He felt Margaret's sharp intake of breath beside him. Spring was still 2 months away, and he could see her mind working through the implications. 2 months of dependency, of being trapped with a man who'd made it clear he valued his solitude above all else. "We can't stay that long," she said quietly. "It wouldn't be fair to you. And you can't leave," as Ezra countered. "It wouldn't be safe for the children." They stood in silence, caught between impossible choices, while the children chattered excitedly about building snow forts and having snowball fights. Only Lucy seemed to sense the adult tension, her eyes moving between Ezra and her mother with the hyper-vigilance of someone who'd learned that grown-up conversations often determine the fate of children. That evening, after the little ones had been settled into sleep, Ezra found himself alone with Margaret by the dying fire. She was mending one of Samuel's shirts with careful stitches, her needle catching the firelight as she worked. The domestic scene should have felt comfortable after 10 days of shared routines, but instead Ezra felt the weight of unspoken questions hanging between them. "Tell me about your daughter," Margaret said suddenly, not looking up from her sewing. The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. "What?" "The way you are with Grace, with all the children, you're not learning how to be gentle with them. You're remembering." Margaret's voice was soft but certain. "And sometimes when you think no one's watching, you get this look in your eyes like you're seeing ghosts." Ezra's first instinct was to shut down the conversation, to retreat behind the walls that had protected him for 7 years. But something in Margaret's tone, understanding rather than prying, compassion rather than curiosity, made the words come despite his better judgment. "Her name was Sarah," he said quietly. "She would have been 8 this winter. Had hair the color of corn silk and a laugh that could chase away the darkest clouds." Margaret's hands stilled on her sewing. "What happened?" "Avalanche. March of '68. The words came out flat, emotionless, the way he'd trained himself to say them when pressed by the few people who dared to ask over the years. "I was up the mountain cutting timber. Anna, my wife, was at home with Sarah, working in the garden. The slide took the whole homestead, buried it under 20 feet of snow and rock." "Oh, Ezra." Margaret's voice was thick with sympathy. "I'm so sorry." "I dug for 3 days," Ezra continued, the words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken inside him. "Even when the other men from town came to help, even when they said it was too late. I kept digging because I couldn't accept that they were gone, that I'd been away working when they needed me most." Margaret set down her sewing and turned to face him fully. "That's why you live alone up here. You blame yourself. I should have been there." The admission came out raw with 7 years of self-recrimination. "If I'd been home, maybe I could have gotten them to safety. Maybe I could have seen the signs, done something. Or maybe you would have died with them," Margaret said gently. "And then there would have been no one to remember their names, no one to carry their love forward." Ezra looked at her sharply, surprised by the directness of her words. "You don't understand." "I understand more than you think." Margaret's voice carried its own weight of loss. "When James died, I spent months convinced that if I'd been a better wife, if I'd made him happier at home, he wouldn't have been in that saloon when the fight broke out. I told myself that my inadequacies as a woman killed my husband and left my children fatherless." "That's different, is it?" Margaret's eyes held his steadily. "We both survived when the people we loved didn't. We both carry guilt for circumstances beyond our control. The only difference is that I had 5 children depending on me, so I couldn't afford to disappear into grief the way you did." The truth of her words settled into the silence between them. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines and the fire crackled softly in the hearth. Ezra felt something shift inside his chest, like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. "How do you do it?" he asked finally. "How do you keep going, keep hoping, when you know how quickly it can all be taken away?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving to where the children slept peacefully in the loft above. Because the alternative is letting fear steal what joy you have left, she said simply. James is gone, but his children are here. They need love and laughter and hope for the future. I can honor his memory by living fully, or I can honor it by dying slowly. I chose to live. Even if it means risking that kind of loss again? Especially then. Margaret's smile was sad but genuine. Love isn't less precious because it's fragile, Ezra. It's more precious. Before Ezra could respond, a small voice drifted down from the loft. Papa Ezra? I had a bad dream. Both adults froze. Papa Ezra. The words hung in the air like a revelation neither was prepared for. Coming, Emma, Ezra called softly, rising from his chair with movements that felt strangely natural despite the hammering of his heart. He climbed the ladder to the loft, where Emma sat among her sleeping siblings, tears glistening on her cheeks in the moonlight filtering through the small window. What was the dream about, sweetheart? He asked, settling beside her on the edge of the makeshift bed. The bad men came back, Emma whispered. The ones who left us in the snow. They wanted to take us away from you, and you couldn't stop them because you're not really our papa. Ezra's chest tightened with protective fury at the thought of anyone frightening this child. Emma, look at me. Those men are long gone, and they can't hurt you anymore. You're safe here. But what if they come back? What if you decide you don't want us anymore, like the guy did? The question hit Ezra harder than any physical blow could have. He looked down at Emma's trusting face, at the way she'd instinctively reached for comfort from a man she'd known less than 2 weeks, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. Emma, he said carefully, would you like me to be your papa? Not just for pretend, but for real? The little girl's eyes widened. Could you? Would Mama let you? I think that's something your mom and I need to talk about, Ezra said gently. But I want you to know that I would be honored to be your papa, if that's what you want. Emma's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. I want that more than anything. Samuel does too. He told me yesterday that he wishes you were our real papa, so we could stay here forever and learn to be mountain people. As Ezra tucked Emma back under the covers and kissed her forehead, a gesture that felt both foreign and completely natural, he realized that somewhere in the space between rescue and routine, between teaching coffee making and reading snow signs, he'd stopped being a reluctant host and started being something much more dangerous, a father. When he climbed back down to the main room, Margaret was waiting by the fire, her expression unreadable. Did you mean what you told her? She asked quietly. Ezra met her eyes, seeing not just the question, but the hope she was trying so hard to hide. I meant every word. The question is whether you'd consider letting a broken-down mountain man try to put the pieces of himself back together by loving your family. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. Oh, Ezra, we're all broken in some way. Maybe that's what makes us perfect for each other. We know how to be gentle with damaged things. As she stepped into his arms, Ezra felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble. For 7 years, he'd believed that loving someone meant risking unbearable loss. But holding Margaret close, listening to the peaceful breathing of children who were already calling him Papa, he realized that Margaret was right. Love wasn't less precious because it was fragile. It was more precious. And some risks were worth taking, even if your heart had been broken before. But what neither of them noticed, in that moment of quiet revelation and new beginning, was the shadow that passed by the cabin window. The shadow of a man who'd been watching and waiting for the right moment to claim what he believed he was owed. Because sometimes the greatest threats to happiness came not from avalanches or storms, but from the darkness that lived in human hearts consumed by greed and desperation. The pounding on Ezra's door came at dawn, violent and demanding, shattering the peaceful morning quiet like gunshots. Margaret jerked awake in his arms, her body immediately tense with the kind of fear that came from experience with men who brought trouble in the early hours. Stay with the children, Ezra whispered, already moving toward where his rifle hung above the fireplace. 7 years of mountain living had honed his instincts sharp as a blade, and every one of them was screaming danger. Through the frost-covered window, he could see 3 men on horseback, their faces hard with the desperate look of men who'd been riding through winter cold with empty bellies and emptier pockets. The one in front, a tall man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, was the one doing the pounding. "Open up!" the scarred man shouted. "We know you got them in there." Ezra's blood turned to ice. Them. They weren't here by accident. "Papa Ezra." Emma's small voice drifted down from the loft, thick with sleep and growing fear. "What's happening?" "Just some travelers looking for directions, sweetheart," Ezra called back, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "Stay up there with your brothers and sisters." The pounding came again, harder this time, and Ezra could hear the wood of his door frame beginning to protest. Margaret appeared beside him, clutching a kitchen knife with hands that shook only slightly. "It's them, isn't it?" she whispered. "The men from the wagon train, Jake Morrison and his friends." Ezra nodded grimly. Jake Morrison had been their guide, the man who'd taken their money and abandoned them in the storm when the going got rough. Apparently survival hadn't taught him wisdom. "We know you're harboring stolen property," Morrison's voice carried clearly through the door. "That woman owes us money, and we've come to collect." "Stolen property." Ezra's voice was deadly quiet as he looked at Margaret. "Is that what they're calling you and the children?" Margaret's face was pale but determined. "When Jake left us, he took most of our supplies and money. He said we could consider it payment for his trouble. But there wasn't enough to satisfy him. He wanted more than we had to give." The implication hit Ezra like a physical blow. These weren't just thieves. They were the kind of men who saw a desperate widow with children as an opportunity to take whatever they pleased. "How did they find us?" Ezra asked, though he was already moving toward the door, rifle in hand. "Tracks in the snow, most likely. Or maybe someone in the last town we passed through mentioned seeing us." Margaret's grip tightened on her knife. "Ezra, you don't understand what these men are capable of. Jake Morrison isn't just a thief. He's the kind of man who takes what he wants and leaves bodies behind." "Collins!" Morrison's voice was getting uglier, more impatient. "I know you can hear me in there. Send out the woman and her brats, and maybe I won't burn your cabin down around your ears." From the loft came the sound of quiet crying, not the loud sobs of terrified children, but the muffled fear of young ones who'd learned that staying quiet might mean staying alive. Ezra felt something dark and protective rise in his chest, a fury so pure it burned away 7 years of careful isolation in an instant. These men had terrorized his family, and yes, they were his family now, as surely as if he'd been there for every birth, every first word, every moment of joy and sorrow. "Margaret," he said quietly, "take the children up to the loft and pile everything you can in front of the ladder. No matter what happens down here, don't come down until I tell you it's safe." "Ezra, no." Margaret's eyes were wide with fear, but not for herself. "There are 3 of them, and they're armed. You can't face them alone." "I've been taking care of myself in these mountains for 7 years," Ezra replied, his voice calm despite the storm building inside him. "But I've never had anything worth dying for until now." He pulled Margaret close, kissing her forehead with a tenderness that belied the violence he was preparing for. "Get the children safe. Trust me to handle the rest." As Margaret climbed the ladder, whispering urgent instructions to the children, Ezra positioned himself beside the door, rifle ready. He could hear Morrison and his men conferring outside, their voices carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Burn him out if we have to. Woman's got to have money hidden somewhere. Kids might be worth something to the right buyer." The last comment made Ezra's vision go red around the edges. These weren't just thieves. They were human predators of the worst kind, the sort who saw children as commodities to be sold. "Morrison!" Ezra called through the door, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from a man who'd faced death before and wasn't impressed by it. "You've got one chance to ride away from here and keep breathing. Take it." Morrison's laughter was ugly and confident. "Big talk from a man outnumbered 3-1. You think we're afraid of some hermit mountain man?" "You should be." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Then Morrison's voice came again, but it was different now, colder, more calculating. "Tell you what, Collins. Send out the woman and we'll let you live. Keep her, and we'll take her anyway after we bury you in the snow. Your choice." "Here's my choice," Ezra replied, opening the door fast and stepping out with his rifle aimed directly at Morrison's chest. "You turn those horses around and ride out of here, or I start shooting." The three men had clearly expected a negotiation, not a direct confrontation. Morrison's horse shied slightly at the sudden appearance of an armed man, but the guide quickly regained control. "You're making a mistake, Collins," Morrison said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Something in Ezra's eyes, a complete lack of fear, a willingness to die fighting, had shifted the balance of the encounter. "The only mistake I made was not shooting you the moment you set foot on my land," Ezra replied. "But I'm feeling generous this morning, so I'm giving you 10 seconds to disappear before I lose my charitable mood. There are 3 of us. 9 seconds." One of Morrison's companions, a nervous man with twitching hands, started to reach for his gun. Ezra's rifle swung toward him with deadly precision. 8 seconds, and friend, if you clear leather with that iron, you'll be dead before you can aim it. 7 seconds. Morrison's face was twisted with rage and humiliation. But he wasn't stupid. He could see that Ezra wasn't bluffing, wasn't posturing. This was a man who'd already decided he was willing to die to protect what was his. "This isn't over, Collins," Morrison snarled. "We'll be back, and next time we won't be so polite." 5 seconds. "You can't watch them forever?" 4. Morrison wheeled his horse around, his companions following with obvious relief. But as they rode away, the scarred man called back over his shoulder, "Enjoy your family while you can, mountain man. Come spring, when the pass is clear, you'll have visitors you won't be able to scare away so easy." As the hoofbeats faded into the distance, Ezra remained standing in the snow, rifle ready until he was certain they were truly gone. Only then did he allow himself to lower the weapon and feel the full weight of what had just happened. They would be back. Morrison wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, and next time he'd come with more men, better planning, and a willingness to use the kind of violence that would make this morning's confrontation look like a polite disagreement. "Ezra?" Margaret's voice came from the cabin doorway, tentative and worried. He turned to find her standing there with baby Grace in her arms, the other children clustered behind her, like scared rabbits ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. "Are they gone?" Lucy asked, her young voice carrying an old soul's wariness. "For now," Ezra said honestly, "but they'll be back." "Then we have to leave," Margaret said immediately. "We can't stay here and put you in danger because of our problems." "No." Ezra's voice was firm as he walked back toward his family, because that's what they were now, whatever the law or society might say about it. "We're not running. This is our home, and we're going to fight for it." Samuel stepped forward, his boy's chest puffed with desperate bravery. "I can fight too, Papa Ezra. I'm not afraid of those bad men." Ezra knelt down and pulled the boy into his arms, feeling the thin body trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. "I know you're brave, son. But fighting isn't always about picking up a gun. Sometimes it's about being smart, being prepared, and protecting the people you love." As he looked around at the faces of his newfound family, Margaret's worried but determined expression, Lucy's protective stance over her younger siblings, the twins' wide-eyed trust that he would somehow make everything right, Ezra realized that Morrison had made one crucial mistake. He'd threatened not just a lonely mountain man with nothing to lose, but a father with everything to protect, and there was no creature on earth more dangerous than a man fighting for his family's survival. The war Morrison wanted was coming whether Ezra chose it or not, but this time, he wouldn't be fighting alone. The next 3 weeks transformed Ezra's cabin from a peaceful refuge into something resembling a frontier fortress. Every morning began before dawn with what Ezra called family training, teaching each member of his household the skills they'd need to survive what was coming. "The key to staying alive isn't being the fastest gun," Ezra explained to Samuel as he showed the boy how to load the old hunting rifle. "It's being prepared, being smart, and never letting your enemy catch you off guard." Samuel nodded with the serious concentration of a 10-year-old who understood that this wasn't a game. Over the past weeks, all the children had matured in ways that broke Ezra's heart, even as it made him proud. They'd absorbed the reality of their situation without losing their essential childhood wonder, adapting to their new circumstances with the resilience that only the young possessed. Margaret had proven herself invaluable in ways Ezra hadn't expected. Her steady hands and sharp mind made her a natural with both firearms and strategy. While he taught the children basic survival skills, she organized their defenses with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd learned to plan for catastrophe. "I've reinforced the root cellar," she reported one evening as they sat by the fire, the children finally asleep after another day of intensive preparation. "If things go badly, Lucy knows to get the little ones down there and bar the door from inside." Ezra looked up from the rifle he was cleaning, noting the determined set of Margaret's jaw. "You've thought of everything." "I've had to." Margaret's voice carried the weight of hard-won experience. "After James died, I learned that hoping for the best meant planning for the worst. I won't let anything happen to these children, Ezra. Not after they've finally found a place where they feel safe." The word safe hung between them, both precious and fragile. Outside, the March wind howled through the pines, carrying the promise of spring thaw and the certainty that Morrison would return with it. "Emma asked me today if we're really going to stay here forever," Margaret continued, her hands busy with mending one of Ethan's shirts. "I told her that was up to you, but she seemed to take it as a yes." Ezra set down his rifle and looked at Margaret, really looked at her. Over the weeks of shared danger and growing intimacy, she'd become the center around which his rebuilt world revolved. Her quiet strength anchored him when the weight of protecting 5 lives threatened to overwhelm him. Her gentle touch soothed fears he didn't even know he still carried. "Margaret," he said quietly, "when this is over, when we've dealt with Morrison and his men, I want to marry you, properly, with a preacher and witnesses and all the promises that matter." Margaret's hands stilled on her sewing. "Even knowing what it means? The danger, the isolation, the hard life up here? Especially knowing that." Ezra reached across the space between them to take her hand. "I spent 7 years convinced that loving people meant losing them. You and the children have taught me that the real loss is never having loved at all." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Ezra Collins. I'll bind my life to yours and call this mountain home for as long as you'll have us." Their kiss was gentle but deep, full of promises and hope despite the danger that surrounded them. When they broke apart, Margaret rested her forehead against his. "The children will be so happy," she said softly. "Lucy's been asking when she can start calling you Papa officially. And Samuel's been practicing writing Samuel Collins when he thinks no one is watching." The image of his name written in a boy's careful script made Ezra's throat tight with emotion. "They're already mine," he said roughly. "Papers and ceremonies won't change that. But I want them to have my name, my protection, everything I can give them." A sound from outside, the soft whinny of a horse, cut through their quiet moment like a blade. Both adults froze, every sense suddenly alert. Ezra was on his feet and moving toward his rifle before the sound faded. Muscle memory from weeks of preparation taking over. "Too early for Morrison," Margaret whispered, but her voice carried uncertainty. Ezra peered carefully through the shuttered window, his rifle ready. In the moonlight, he could see a single rider approaching slowly, hands clearly visible and empty. Not the aggressive posture of an attack, but someone approaching with deliberate caution. "Hello, the cabin!" The voice was young, male, and carried exhaustion rather than threat. "I'm looking for help." "My horse is injured, and I've been riding for days." Ezra studied the figure carefully. Young man, maybe 20, riding a limping mare through snow that should have turned back anyone with sense. Either a very good actor or genuinely desperate. "What kind of help?" Ezra called back, not moving from his position by the window. "Shelter for the night, maybe some grain for my horse if you can spare it. I can pay. I've got silver." Margaret appeared beside Ezra, her own rifle in hand. "Could be a trick," she whispered. "Morrison might send someone to scout us." "Maybe. But if he's genuine, we can't leave him out there to freeze." Ezra made his decision. "You can approach, but keep your hands where I can see them. Any sudden moves, and you'll be eating lead for supper." The young man rode closer, and in the better light from the cabin windows, Ezra could see he was indeed young. Barely more than a boy, really, with the kind of open, honest face that was hard to fake. His horse was clearly favoring one leg, and both rider and mount showed signs of hard travel. "Thank you," the young man called. "Name's David Miller. I've been riding from Denver with urgent news for the settlements." "What kind of news?" Margaret asked, stepping into view beside Ezra. David's face was grim despite his youth. "Jake Morrison and his gang hit another family 2 days south of here, killed the husband, took everything of value, and left the wife and children to die in the cold." His voice carried genuine outrage. "The territorial marshal has finally put a price on Morrison's head. $500, dead or alive." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. Morrison wasn't just planning to return. He was working his way through the territory, leaving a trail of bodies and broken families in his wake. "How many men does he have now?" Ezra asked. "Last count was 8, maybe 9. All hard cases, the kind who kill for sport as much as profit." David's eyes moved between Ezra and Margaret. "You folks wouldn't happen to know anything about Morrison, would you?" "Word is he's been asking around about a woman and her children who went missing during a blizzard." Margaret and Ezra exchanged glances. This young man might be their salvation or their doom, depending on which side he was really on. "Depends on who's asking," Ezra said carefully. David seemed to understand the caution. "I'm asking because my sister was Jake Morrison's last victim. Left her with 3 little ones and no way to survive the winter." His voice was thick with grief and rage. "I've been tracking him for 2 weeks, and if you know where he is, I'd appreciate the information." "We don't know where he is," Margaret said gently, "but we know he's coming here, and when he does, we'll be ready for him." David's eyes sharpened with interest and approval. "Then maybe we can help each other. I've got a good rifle, steady hands, and personal reasons for wanting Morrison dead. If you're planning to make a stand against him, I'd like to be part of it." Ezra studied the young man's face, seeing in it the same protective fury he'd felt when Morrison threatened his own family. Sometimes fate sent exactly what you needed, even when you didn't know you needed it. "Come inside," Ezra said finally. "Let's talk about making Jake Morrison regret the day he decided to prey on families." As David Miller dismounted and led his limping horse toward the shelter, Ezra felt a grim satisfaction settle in his chest. Morrison was coming with 8 or 9 men, expecting to face a lone mountain man protecting a helpless family. Instead, he'd find a fortress defended by people who had everything to fight for and nothing left to lose. The hunter was about to discover that sometimes the prey had teeth of its own. The attack came with the dawn of the first warm day in April, when the snow had begun its retreat and the mountain air carried the promise of spring. Ezra spotted them first, 9 riders moving through the trees with the practiced stealth of men who'd made killing their profession. "Positions," he called quietly, and his family moved with the precision of soldiers who drilled for this moment. Margaret took her place at the window facing east, rifle ready. David Miller crouched behind the reinforced woodpile that now served as a firing position. Lucy herded the younger children toward the root cellar, her young face set with determination. "Remember," Ezra said to Samuel, who clutched his rifle with white knuckles, "don't shoot unless you have a clear target and don't waste ammunition. We don't know how long this will last." Samuel nodded solemnly. "I won't let you down, Papa." The word Papa hit Ezra like a physical blow, filling him with a fierce protectiveness that burned away any lingering doubts about the violence to come. These men had come to destroy his family, and he would die before he let that happen. Morrison's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Collins! We know you're in there. Send out the woman and her brats, and we might let you live long enough to watch what we do to them." The crude laughter that followed made Ezra's vision go red around the edges. Beside him, Margaret's face was pale but determined, her finger steady on the trigger. "Last chance, Collins," Morrison called again. "We've got you surrounded, and we've got all day." Ezra's response was to put a bullet through the tree trunk 6 inches from Morrison's head, the crack of his rifle echoing across the clearing like thunder. "That's my answer, you son of a bitch," Ezra shouted back. "Come and take them." What followed was chaos, the kind of violence that transformed peaceful morning into a symphony of gunfire and shouting. Morrison's men had expected easy prey, but they found themselves facing coordinated resistance from multiple positions. David Miller proved his worth immediately. his shots finding their marks with deadly precision. Margaret's rifle spoke with steady rhythm, each shot carefully aimed and effective. The first wave of attackers came hard, expecting to overwhelm the cabin through sheer aggression. They were met with a withering crossfire that dropped 2 men before they'd covered half the distance to the house. Morrison's angry shouts could be heard above the gunfire, cursing his men's incompetence. "They've got more guns than we thought," one of the attackers yelled. "This ain't just one man." "I don't care if they've got a damn army in there," Morrison snarled back. "I want that woman, and I want her alive." But Morrison had underestimated more than just the number of defenders. He'd underestimated what people would do when they were fighting for home and family rather than greed and cruelty. Samuel, despite his youth, proved he had his adoptive father's steady nerves. When one of Morrison's men tried to circle around to the cabin's blind spot, the boy's rifle cracked once, and the man went down with a cry of pain and surprise. "Good shot, son," Ezra called, and he could hear the pride in his own voice despite the deadly circumstances. The battle raged for nearly an hour, with Morrison's gang gradually learning that the cabin was far better defended than they'd anticipated. 2 more of his men had fallen, and the survivors were becoming increasingly frustrated and desperate. "Boss," one of them called, "maybe we should just burn them out." "No!" Morrison's voice was sharp with rage. "The woman's no good to us dead, you idiot. We need her alive." That was Morrison's mistake, revealing that this wasn't about money or revenge anymore, but about something darker. Ezra felt his rage crystallize into cold, deadly purpose. "David," he called to the young man, "can you cover me?" "What are you planning?" David called back, never taking his eyes off his sector of fire. "I'm going to end this." Ezra looked at Margaret, seeing in her eyes the same recognition he felt. This wouldn't be over until Morrison was dead. "Keep them safe." "Ezra, no." But he was already moving, slipping out through the reinforced back door, while David's rifle kept the attackers pinned down. Ezra moved through the forest like the ghost he'd been for 7 years, using every skill he'd learned in his isolation to circle around behind Morrison's position. He found Morrison crouched behind a fallen log, shouting orders to his remaining men. The scarred man's face was twisted with frustrated rage, his expensive clothes torn and dirty from the prolonged battle. "Jake Morrison," Ezra's voice was quiet, deadly calm. Morrison spun around, his gun half drawn, to find Ezra standing 20 feet away with his rifle aimed directly at the outlaw's chest. This close, there was no possibility of missing. "You made one big mistake, Morrison," Ezra continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You threatened my family." Morrison's hand froze on his gun, recognizing death when he saw it. "Collins, wait. We can make a deal. I've got money, connections." "You could—" "The only thing you've got," Ezra interrupted, "is about 2 seconds to make peace with whatever God you believe in." "Please." Ezra's rifle spoke once, and Jake Morrison's reign of terror ended with a sound like thunder echoing through the mountain valley. The remaining outlaws, hearing their leader's distinctive scream cut off abruptly, began to panic. Without Morrison's voice driving them forward, their attacks became disorganized, desperate. One by one, they broke and ran, disappearing into the forest like the cowards they'd always been beneath their bragging and cruelty. When Ezra returned to the cabin, he found his family waiting. Margaret with tears streaming down her face, Samuel standing proud and tall despite his youth, Lucy comforting the twins while baby Grace slept peacefully in her makeshift crib. "Is it over?" Margaret asked, though she could see the answer in Ezra's eyes. "It's over," he confirmed, pulling her into his arms. "Morrison's dead, and his men scattered." "They won't be back." David Miller emerged from his position, grinning despite the powder burns on his face. "My sister can rest easy now," he said with deep satisfaction. Morrison got what he deserved. That evening, as they sat around the fire sharing a meal that tasted like victory and new beginnings, Emma climbed into Ezra's lap with the casual confidence of a child who knew she was safe and loved. "Papa Ezra," she said, using the name that had become natural to all of them, "are we really going to stay here forever?" Ezra looked around at the faces of his family, Margaret's gentle strength, Lucy's protective spirit, Samuel's growing courage, the twins' innocent joy. baby Grace's peaceful trust. 7 years ago, he'd buried his heart with his first family, but hearts, he'd learned, had the miraculous ability to grow back stronger than before. Forever sounds just about right, he said, kissing Emma's forehead. This is our home now, and nothing's going to change that. 3 months later, Ezra Collins married Margaret Sinclair in the small church in the valley town below their mountain home. Lucy served as maid of honor, Samuel and the twins as ring bearers, and baby Grace gurgled happily throughout the ceremony. David Miller gave the bride away, having become an honorary member of their extended family. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence was filled with nothing but love and approval from the small congregation of neighbors who'd come to respect the mountain man and his chosen family. As they exchanged vows, Ezra thought about the man he'd been 7 years ago, broken, isolated, convinced that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. That man would never have recognized the person he'd become, a husband, a father, a man whose life overflowed with purpose and joy. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher said with a smile. And as Ezra kissed his wife while their children cheered and the congregation applauded, he knew that sometimes the best families weren't born. They were chosen, forged in the crucible of shared struggle, and blessed with the kind of love that transformed even the most broken hearts. Later, as they all made their way back up the mountain to the cabin that had become a true home, Emma skipped alongside the wagon and asked the question that made Ezra's heart swell with pride and contentment. "Papa, will you tell us the story again about how you found us in the snow?" "Every night if you want," Ezra replied, looking at Margaret beside him on the wagon seat, at the children who'd made him a father again, at the mountain landscape that had witnessed his transformation from hermit to family man. Some stories, he realized, were worth telling over and over again, especially the ones that began with a man who'd given up on love and ended with a family that proved love never gives up on anyone. The mountain wind carried the sound of their laughter across the peaks, and for the first time in 7 years, Ezra Collins was completely, utterly, perfectly home. And there you have it. Ezra Collins's incredible journey from a broken hermit hiding from love to a devoted father who'd faced down 9 armed men to protect his chosen family. This story proves that sometimes the most beautiful families aren't born from blood, but forged in the crucible of shared struggle and unconditional love. What strikes me most about Ezra's transformation is how it shows us that healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in community, in connection, in the daily choice to open our hearts despite the risk of being hurt again. For 7 years, Ezra believed that the safest heart was a closed one, that loving people meant losing them, but Margaret and her children taught him that the real tragedy isn't losing love. It's never having the courage to embrace it in the first place. Margaret's role in this story is equally powerful. She wasn't a helpless victim waiting to be rescued, but a strong woman who became Ezra's equal partner in building their family's future. When the final battle came, she stood rifle in hand, defending their home with the same fierce determination as any frontier warrior. She showed us that true partnership isn't about one person saving another. It's about 2 people choosing to face life's challenges together, each bringing their own strength to the fight. And let's talk about those children who transformed from frightened refugees into a confident, loving family unit. Samuel's courage in that final battle, standing beside his adopted father and proving himself a true Collins. Lucy's maturity in protecting her younger siblings while still finding the innocent joy of calling someone Papa officially. Emma's simple question, "Will you tell us the story again?" reminding us that the best stories are the ones we live ourselves. The children's instant adoption of Ezra as Papa teaches us something profound about the human capacity for love and trust. They didn't need blood relations or legal documents to recognize a father's heart when they saw one. Love, they understood instinctively, isn't about genetics. It's about choice, commitment, and the daily decision to show up for the people who matter most. Ezra's final confrontation with Jake Morrison represents more than just good triumphing over evil. It's about a man who'd finally found something worth fighting for. The hermit who'd spent 7 years avoiding human connection became a warrior when his family was threatened, proving that love doesn't make us weak, it makes us fierce. The wedding scene perfectly captures the community acceptance that Ezra's family had earned through their courage and commitment. No longer outsiders or charity cases, they'd become respected members of their frontier community, showing us that respect is earned not through conformity, but through character. As we watch Ezra and Margaret exchange vows surrounded by their children and friends, we witness the beautiful truth that it's never too late to start over, never too late to choose love over fear, never too late to build the family you've always dreamed of having. What did you connect with most in Ezra and Margaret's story? Have you ever had to choose between the safety of isolation and the risk of loving again? Have you seen the power of chosen family in your own life? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing how these frontier love stories resonate with your own experiences of healing and hope. If this tale of second chances and chosen family touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the best chapters of our lives often begin when we find the courage to let others in. Your support helps us continue bringing you these incredible stories of love, resilience, and redemption from America's Wild West. Speaking of incredible stories, next week we're diving into a tale that'll have you questioning everything you think you know about justice and forgiveness. Picture this. A former Confederate soldier turned preacher arrives in a small town to build a church, but the local sheriff recognizes him as the man who killed his brother during the war. Now these two men must choose between the justice of revenge and the mercy of redemption. Can faith heal the wounds of war, or are some betrayals too deep to forgive? Join us next time for The Preacher's Past, a story of faith tested by fury, where two broken men must decide if healing is worth more than hatred. You won't want to miss this powerful exploration of forgiveness set against the unforgiving backdrop of the American frontier. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our weekly journeys into the heart of the Wild West, where broken hearts learn to beat again, and every ending is just a new beginning waiting to unfold. Until next time, remember that the best families are built not by accident, but by choice. And every day we get to choose love over fear is a day we write our own redemption story. This is Wild West Stories, where courage meets love on the American frontier.